He's an active duty law enforcement officer. He's an accidental expert. I say accident. He was assigned to child abuse investigations and became an expert in Munchausen by proxy. He's here to talk about that very disturbing trend. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, it brings about heartache and unimaginable pain and suffering for people. Munchausen by proxy. Don't know what that is? Stick around. You're about to find out on the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. Welcome to the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. In the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show, we are joined by special guests talking about their experiences, the realities of investigating crimes, plus those who have experienced horrendous trauma. Police, first responders, military, and victims of crime share their stories. Hi, I'm John J. Wiley. In addition to being a broadcaster, I'm also a retired police sergeant. Be sure to check out our website, letradio.com, and also like us on Facebook. Search for the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. Be sure to follow the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and podcast on the Newsbreak app. Newsbreak is your #1 local news app for current events, free live news for you and your community. Download the Newsbreak app today for free, and be sure to follow the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and podcast on the Newsbreak app. Join us today from Texas. We have Michael Weber on the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. Michael is an active duty law enforcement officer getting ready to retire. He's got his time in, and he is a child abuse investigator. And I said earlier, he became an accidental expert in Munchausen by proxy. A lot of people don't know what that is. You go, no, I think I've heard it before. I don't know what it is. He's the author of the book, The Mother Next Door, Medicine, Deceit, and Munchausen by Proxy. And his website is MikeWeberConsulting.com. First, Mike, thanks so much for your service, #1. #2, thanks for being a guest on the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. Very much appreciated.
Thank you for having me.
Look, one of the things I found most disturbing in my police career was two things, actually. One was any kind of violence or abuse of children that are not able to defend themselves, especially from so-called loved ones. And the other one was abuse of elderly people that were not able to defend themselves either. And there's a lot of people in between that got accosted, violated, murdered, you name it, and all that stuff took a toll. But those two really rang the bell for me. Is it fair to say they got your attention as well?
Yes. Once I got into it, absolutely, it got my attention. And they're some of the hardest cases to work. Not just Munchausen by proxy, but any form of child abuse is some of the hardest cases to work, because obviously a lot of times you have no physical evidence, and a lot of times you don't have a witness that can tell you this is what happened, because a lot of times the child is nonverbal. They're 1-2 years old. They're not going to be able to tell you what happened to them.
And I do remember a case, before we get into the story, of a toddler, I would say less than 2 years old, when I was a police in Baltimore. And the parent, I believe it was her mother at the time, was putting out lit cigarettes on the child's back. So we had evidence of the burns.
Right.
And those things, kind of cases, bruises are one thing. How they got them is another. We don't know that all the time. But you had to trust your gut and conduct an investigation the best way you could. So you follow the evidence. But the main thing was, I found it so hard for me, Mike, and I'm going to ask you, was taking myself out of the equation, being a police, and not getting actively involved, emotionally involved, and wanting to retaliate against the parent.
Well, and do you have kids?
Yes, I do.
And, I think that's how come I've been able to stay in this so long. I do not have children. Right, so I'm not seeing my child in any of these cases. And, I work really hard mentally to divorce myself from work when I'm not at work. I'm not always successful in that role, but you have to have hobbies. You have to have things you do outside of work to take your mind off of work and take your mind away from work.
We used to have guys, and I say guys, that's men and women. That's the term that we use in policing, guys, that we thought they were square because they were actively involved in their church, or they were scoutmasters, or they weren't square dancing, whatever it was. And I'm like, yeah, what an idiot, you're doing that, instead of going out, drinking beer with the guys. And guess what? They're the ones who held it together the best. And one of the things I found out was whatever hobbies you had before, I don't care if it's doing the model ships in the bottles, whatever it is, continue doing it. Don't lose sight of who you are based off your job, and it's the hardest thing in the world to do.
Correct. I mean, you've got to have an outlet that's not police work. We see a lot of younger guys who, this is, the job can be kind of all encompassing, and you want to get together, you want to talk about things that you saw on shift, but you need to divorce yourself from that. You need to get some type of separation, have friends outside of law enforcement, which has really helped me. I have a lot of friends outside of law enforcement, and we don't talk about law enforcement when we get together.
Yeah.
Maybe we talk about college basketball. Maybe we talk about college football. Maybe we talk about a whole host of other things, but we don't talk about work.
One of the things that helped me the most is, and I always say this, if you really want to get my attention, you really want to help me, let's talk about fishing. Let's talk about other things. Because I'm not going to tell you. And by the way, if you're not police, and even other police or certain ones, I won't tell them when things are going. I won't go into details about it because I don't want to hear the conversation. I don't want to hear the questions. But one of the things I got, and this is paraphrasing, but when I was on the job, it doesn't happen so much anymore because I'm an old geezer now, and people don't think about it. But you're having a barbecue, you're in someone's backyard, and they ask you a question, hey, did you ever shoot anybody? I just turned around and said, yes, and then left. And they didn't like the response they got. I'm like, what makes you think I want to have that conversation with a total stranger over a beer? Right.
Well, and I think a lot of people just don't know how to react around police. They don't know what to say to you, so they say this some of the dumbest stuff ever. And I just kind of laugh it off. I'll make a joke or I'll do something like that.
You're nicer than I am, Mike. You're a lot nicer.
I'm like, no, but I shot a dog, and you can never be too careful with Dachshunds. Something like that. And they look at you weird. And
don't even get me started. Social media, with the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show Facebook page, I'm on it all day long. I post. I almost never read the comments because most of the comments, I'd say 99% of them are very supportive. They're very good. We've got a lot of supporters out there, but there's always one, all you guys want to do is rape kids and shoot dogs. What? Where do you come up with that? I never shot a dog. Every cop I worked with never shot a dog. We don't want to shoot anybody, but you're not going to convince that person otherwise.
Well, there's they listen to media, and media doesn't tell the truth all the time about us. So
you can repeat that again for the people in the peanut gallery.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I certainly don't look at social media comments. I mean, you're talking about the lowest form of dialogue.
Absolutely. I believe it was Mark Twain or one of those people that's a lot brighter than I said, never argue an idiot because they'll just drag you to their level and beat you with years of experience. And I always add into there, especially on social media, because then you're drawing a crowd. Hey, hold my beer because I'm going to show you how bad I could look. But someone who doesn't even matter to you.
I joke all the time when I'm giving trainings, which, we'll get into later, the reason for that. But I joke all the time that, Mark Zuckerberg may have 666 somewhere in his hairline.
Yeah, I think so.
Social media is done to society.
Don't even get me started on because we could have a discussion about that. Totally.
Yeah.
Mike, you've been in law enforcement your entire career, and you got assigned to investigating child abuse cases. Am I correct?
That's correct. I originally started investigating them with Arlington Police Department before I retired from Arlington.
Wait a second. This is your second career in law enforcement?
Yes. I am working on pension number 2.
Oh, my God.
40 years.
Is there something? I'll ask a stupid question. Is there something wrong with you?
Well, the problem is I've worked I started at Kennedale, small town, went to Mansfield, a bigger town, chasing money as cops do.
Right.
And then went to Arlington, which is a big city. Arlington's now, I think, close to 700,000 population. And then I retired Arlington, went to the Tarrant County DA's office as a DA investigator in 2008, worked there till 2018 until we elected a DA who didn't want her investigators investigating anything and basically wanted them being doing nothing but servicing
paper
attorneys.
shufflers. And the most dangerous thing they encounter is a rusty paperclip. We're talking with Michael Weber. He's an active duty law enforcement, getting ready to retire again. His website is MikeWeberConsulting.com, and his book is called The Mother Next Door, Medicine, Deceit, and Munchausen by Proxy, which we'll talk about in a few moments. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Learn how you can be ultra successful on Facebook and possibly earn an income from Meta. Learn how to work smarter and not harder on Facebook. Get step-by-step instructions on what to do and what not to do. Start with a free membership. Get details at letbreak.com, letbreak.com. That's letbreak.com.
Be sure to follow the Law Enforcement Talk radio show and podcast on the Newsbreak app. Newsbreak is your #1 local news app for current events, free live news for you and your community. Download the Newsbreak app today for free and be sure to follow the Law Enforcement Talk radio show and podcast on the Newsbreak app. Return our conversation with Mike Weber. He's an active duty law enforcement officer for his second career, and he's getting ready to retire. He is an accidental expert in Munchausen by Proxy in the state of Texas. His website is MikeWeberConsulting.com, and his book is called The Mother Next Door, Medicine, Deceit, and Munchausen by Proxy. Before we went to break, Mike, we're talking a little bit about your career, and you got into investigating child abuse. Is that where you got your first exposure to Munchausen by Proxy? And by the way, a lot of people don't know what that is. What is Munchausen by Proxy?
Right, Munchausen by Proxy, and I identify it as medical child abuse, which I think is a much better name. It is a process where a caregiver intentionally, very key word, this is intentional, either exaggerates, falsifies, or induces a medical illness in their child. And they do that. It can be so easily done just by going to a doctor and lying to a doctor about the symptoms your child is having, intentionally lying to them. And you can get people are like, well, why would a doctor ever do a procedure that isn't needed? Well, medical testing isn't 100% ever, as I learned when I started this. And it's, the most common procedure in this is a feeding tube, so a G tube inserted through the stomach, through the muscle wall, into the stomach to feed directly through a tube into the stomach. And the easiest way to get that is you starve your child at home. You go to the doctor, say, my child's not eating, my child has diarrhea, the doctor sees your kid for 20 minutes. The doctor relies on the history from the parent. And they see a child falling off the growth scale, right? They see this child not gaining weight. They see actual symptoms. So they're going to try to fix it. And they'll put a feeding tube in the kid. And we see a lot of kids with feeding tubes in this abuse.
And the part that this conflicts with me being a parent. And a lot of people, parents or grandparents, aunts, uncles, doesn't matter. I may not be in love with my child all the time and what they do, but I don't want any harm done to them.
Right.
This idea of abusing your child physically doesn't make sense to me. The idea of abusing them emotionally doesn't make sense to me, although we all have our moments. But the idea of purposely misleading doctors so that their child will get attention and medical attention really baffles my mind. I can't wrap my hands around this mentally.
Well, and, that's really a problem with a lot of law enforcement. A lot of seasoned detectives have a real issue trying to wrap their head around this and actually see it as abuse. And if there's one thing I can get across to your law enforcement audience, if you have one of these cases, realize these offenders absolutely know what they're doing. They know what they're doing is wrong when they are doing it. They present in an interview setting no different than any other child abuse offender that I've ever interviewed. They'll first lie. Then you'll hit them with some additional facts. They'll change their story. And then you may get admissions and you'll never get the whole truth. And it is an intentional act. They aren't crazy. They know what they're doing. They're intentionally harming their child. It is a compulsion very similar to pedophilia.
Yeah, and I guess that's a one way of looking at it. I can't recall off the top of my head a case of Munchausen by Proxy. I know there are many of them, but how far different is this from, I think her name was Susan Smith, where she drove her car in a lake and drowned her 2 kids that were toddlers? Well,
and her motivation was not the motivation in this, right? The motivation in this form of abuse is intrinsic gain. So attention, a lot of times it can be attention from social media. One of the offenders in the book, her entire way of gaining attention with social media. She had no friends in real life. It can be attention from a family member. It can be anything intrinsic in this abuse. And actually, this abuse was just put in the DSM in 2013, and it's labeled as factitious disorder imposed on another. And for it to be actual factitious disorder imposed on another, the main goal of the offender has to be intrinsic gain. Right? They can't be doing it for money. They can't be doing it because they're trying to get their kid declared disabled or anything, or drug seeking for themselves. They can't be doing it for any of those reasons. The main reason has to be intrinsic gain. So they're doing it to fulfill some need in themselves that's not being.
And here's the thing that I don't get. My wife and I, even though I have a nationally syndicated radio show, and I talk for a living on the radio, we're pretty private. We post on social media a lot for a purpose, and it's never about me. But we don't talk about stuff that's going on in our lives, because the one thing we don't want is, oh, you poor thing, I'm sending you. Right. And there's nothing wrong with thoughts and prayers. I got nothing against it. I'm a praying person. However, I don't post things deliberately because I don't want that kind of attention. And it seems like there's a lot of people, oh, my dog has a stubbed toe. By the way, we just put our dog down, and it's the hardest thing we ever did. But we don't put it on there because we don't want that kind of attention. And I see people put stuff, my daughter has cancer, my young one is sick with leukemia, whatever it might be. And they get bombarded with the, oh, you poor thing.
Right. And these offenders, their social media accounts, they can have up to, who knows how many followers, and they thrive on, unlike you, they thrive on that attention. Their social media accounts, that works both ways. Yeah, it's great attention for them, but it's also great evidence for us in these cases.
We'll talk more about that social media aspect in a moment. I want people to, this is offshoot, if you are looking for ways to become more successful with your Facebook, check out my Patreon page, patreon.com, Facebook Success with John J. Wiley. So we talked about people getting, I guess, that gratification, Mike, for the attention they want. And I've seen, and maybe it's my mind deliberately blocking out the details of these, because it's Munchausen by proxy has been going on for a lot longer than most people realize, hasn't it?
Correct. Yeah, it was initially identified, I believe, in the early 70s by Dr. Roy Meadows. The interesting thing about that, you hear Munchausen by proxy. A lot of people apply that as a psychological diagnosis of the mother. The man who coined that term was a child abuse pediatrician. He had no psych background. It was initially coined to be a diagnosis of what the child was going through. But as a society, we don't want to accept that a mother could do this to a child. So we as a society, through our media, have kind of turned that term around, and we have applied it to the mother, when that's not what it was meant for at all.
That's interesting, because the first thing people say is, oh, there must be something very wrong with her. She must be very disturbed. She must be mentally ill to do that.
Right. Well, and as any cop knows, any behavior outside the norm, they're disturbed, right? If you kill someone, you're disturbed. If you sexually abuse a child, you're disturbed. You're still committing a crime.
That's right.
But we tend to give these offenders a pass because they're mothers. And it is, I say all the time, this abuse from an understanding perspective is about where sexual abuse was in the 60s and about where human trafficking was in the 90s.
We're going to take a short break. We're talking with Mike Weber. He's an active duty law enforcement officer. He's become an accidental expert on Munchausen by proxy. His website is MikeWeberConsulting.com, and his book is The Mother Next Door, Medicine, Deceit, and Munchausen by Proxy. This is a Law Enforcement Talk Radio show. We're going to take a short break. I promise you don't want to miss what's coming up next, so don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. You can find us on Facebook. Just search for the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and be sure to click like.
Did you know that there are people earning $30,000 or more per month from Meta or Facebook? Did you know that you can too? All without breaking the time bank. Learn how to work smarter and not harder on Facebook. Get step-by-step instructions on what to do and what not to do. Start with a free membership. Get details at letbreak.com. letbreak.com, That's letbreak.com.
We're starting a conversation with Mike Weber on the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. Mike is an active duty law enforcement officer. Jokingly, I said not for long. He's getting ready to retire, by the way. When word gets out that he's on the radio, I think they're okay with it. He has a website, MikeWeberConsulting.com, and he's written a book, The Mother Next Door, Medicine, Deceit, and Munchausen by Proxy. He's become an accidental expert in Munchausen by Proxy, investigating child abuse incidents. Mike, let's talk about your very first Munchausen. And by the way, I don't get that name, Munchausen by Proxy, but remind me to ask you that later on. Tell me about the very first case you had with that.
Yeah, the very first case I had that we prosecuted here in Tarrant County was Hope Ybarra. I had a case previous to that. I had gone to the DA's office in 2008. I got assigned a case. I did a terrible job on it because there was no template, right? No one's telling me how to do this. I talked to Dr. Mark Feldman, who was a great resource. I talked to a prosecutor, Michael Trent, in Houston, who had prosecuted a couple of the cases, and I talked to my child abuse pediatrician. I worked that case horribly. Everything happened out of the state. We transferred it. I go to my lead prosecutor. I'm like, hey, why don't you give me any more of these that come in? They're really complicated, and they're going to be hard for a detective with a caseload to work. And she's like, Mike, that's fine. I've been here 8 years. We haven't had any of these. I'm like, oh, great. They're a lot of work, so that's good. Well, like 3 months later, we got the Hope Ybarra case. And Hope was a mother, and like about half of my offenders, she had falsely presented herself as having cancer. And when I say that, she had convinced her family that she had cancer. She convinced her husband. They had, she'd had 2 remission parties, and then she told them it had come back again and spread to her brain, and she was going to die. But she also had a daughter that she presented as having cystic fibrosis. And she had falsified a sweat test, for those who don't know, because I dang sure didn't when I started this. The presumptive test for cystic fibrosis is you take a cotton patch, you put it on the child's arm, you send the child off to play with mom for 30, 45 minutes. You come back, you collect the salt, and if the salt content in the sweat is above a certain number, you're presumptive positive for cystic fibrosis, right? And she had these positive sweat tests, and so she was being treated for cystic fibrosis. She had a feeding tube. She had a central line, which is venous access through the chest, basically to the heart for medication administration. And it came out that Hope didn't have cancer, which is how everything got kicked off. And her mom was familiar with Munchausen by Proxy. So they contacted the Cook's Children's, the child's pulmonologist, who ordered mom to come back in, or asked mom to come back in and for to have the child retested. Mom refused. They contacted CPS. CPS came in and made them bring the child back in. And, the next sweat test, they kept Hope out of the room initially. For the first one, it was negative. Cystic fibrosis is a genetic disease. You don't have it, not have it. So they brought her back in. They did a second test, because they always repeat medical tests, because medical testing is never 100% accurate. And so they did a second test, and Hope conned her way back into the room, because these offenders are extremely good con artists. But during that second test, she was caught tampering with the bandage. And when they told her to get away from the bandage, then she throws a fit, says she needs to take the victim into the bathroom so she, Hope, can have a breakdown. And victim's in the corner playing fine. Of course, the second test, she knew she was caught, right? The second test came back negative. Again, shows that she knows what she's doing and she knows it's wrong. Second test came back negative, and that's when I kind of came into play with it. And, yeah, it was a shock to me. What we ended up charging her for, we charged for a feeding tube, which was placed in Dallas County. But we ended up charging her here because she had brought her child in and brought her child in for
medical treatment, which was none of this was needed.
None of this is needed. No, none of this was needed. After separation, that child had the feeding tube removed, the central line removed, and was a healthy, active child.
Here's the thing
Nothing
that really baffles me, and a lot about this does baffle me, Michael, to be totally honest with you, is I would have no idea what the testing is for cystic fibrosis. If you hadn't told me, I'd have no idea. That person had to have looked. She had to have looked and researched it to find out, then figure out a way to research it and beat it and get a false indication of positive. That shows a level of malice that really is hard to comprehend, because remember, this is her
child.
A
level of intent, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's intentional deceit. She knows what she's doing. She knows it's wrong when she's doing it.
It's not like, oh, by the way, I slipped and fell on a bar of soap and it was done by accident. This is all on purpose.
Exactly. Well, and she had a central line, so she had venous access to the child's blood, and then the child actually started presenting with anemia, and so she brought her into Cook's Children's and wanted a iron dextride treatment done, which they normally don't do because it causes kids to go into anaphylactic shock. She's like, no, she's had it before. Another hospital just do it. She tried to get the doctor to push it quickly and avoid protocol. The doctor said no. And of course, as soon as they administer it, this child goes into anaphylactic shock. And so the way we charged her for this was bleeding her daughter, right? So she made her daughter anemic by bleeding her, which caused anemia, which caused iron dextride treatment, which caused anaphylactic shock. Absent medical intervention was a substantial risk of death, and that's how we got to our injury to child serious bodily injury charge. As you can see, that's going to be a long road to hoe at trial.
Yeah.
Right. And Hope was a pathological liar outside of just the health of her child. She told her family she had a PhD. She had PhD on her car. She had TCU sticker on her car. She had PhD on her business cards. She actually did have a college degree, an undergrad degree in chemistry. She had falsified her employment application. She was a lab supervisor. She ended up removing pathogens from the food testing lab that later showed up in her daughter. And she would later go on to admit to poisoning her. Well, she would later, in my interview with her, she admitted to putting them in her daughter's sputum sample. The only problem was there was only ever one sputum sample taken from her daughter, and it was in her daughter multiple times, these pathogens. They found salmonella on a lung culture. Salmonella is a GI tract pathogen.
Right.
And she would later admit, after she pled guilty, she would later admit in successive interviews that she had placed these pathogens in the child's breathing treatment for the false diagnosis of asthma.
I taking aside the child abuse part, which we'll go back to in a moment. Just right. the lying about the PhDs and all this other stuff is exhausting to me. I don't know where people get the energy to do this, to think about that sort of stuff.
And offenders on Hope's level, especially those inducing symptoms, like Hope did, and just on Hope level where she's lying about multiple things in her life, I think there's, I'm not a psychologist, but, I am a cop, which is kind of the same
Pretty
thing.
Close.
So I think they get some type of intrinsic thrill out of fooling people, especially people they perceive as smarter than themselves. And I think it becomes a psychological game to them.
And that's going to bring up another question, which we'll talk about when we return. We're going to take a short break. We're talking about Mike Weber. He's an active duty law enforcement officer getting retired from police work in January. He's author of the book, The Mother Next Door, Medicine, Deceit, and Munchausen by Proxy. He's become an accidental Munchausen by Proxy expert in the state of Texas, and his website is MikeWeberConsulting.com. Don't go anywhere. I promise you, we'll be right back. What is the Newsbreak app, and why should you follow the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and podcast on the Newsbreak app? Newsbreak is your #1 local news app for current events, free live news for you and your community. Download the Newsbreak app today for free, and be sure to follow the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and podcast on the Newsbreak app. Return conversation with Mike Weber on the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. He's an active duty law enforcement officer in the state of Texas. He's a detective getting ready to retire in January. And while investigating child abuse, he became an unwilling expert investigating Munchausen by proxy, clearing multiple cases. His website is MikeWeberConsulting.com, and the name of his book is The Mother Next Door, Medicine, Deceit, and Munchausen by Proxy. Before we went to break, Mike, I got to be honest with you. One of the questions I have is how do you take a case like this to court? Because child abuse cases can be tough, especially you said earlier on, if they're not verbal, if they're very young, and there's no witnesses, and there's not a whole lot of physical evidence, it's tough. You got to follow your gut, but there's a thing we need in America called probable cause. And then It's like, it's a little bit more than reasonable suspicion, but not enough evidence to convict someone in court. Then we also have conferences with state's attorneys and district attorneys, whatever terms you use across the country. Is this something winnable in court? You had to have your mindset. Just in the one case you talked about, and there's multiples. How do you prosecute these things? It's mind blowing to me that I don't even know where to start preparing a case.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, it's going to come down to the evidence in each individual case, right? So you have to have medical record review. And by that, I mean medical record review of the child from birth. So you're talking, in a 5-year-old, that's 40,000 pages of records. You've got to have the resources to do that review. Usually it's going to be your child abuse pediatrician. I'm lucky in my jurisdiction currently, our children's hospital has a dedicated position for an RN. Her entire job is medical record review on medical child abuse cases, and she's extremely busy. So you've got to have that aspect. And then I've got to, you put that in every medical history that mom gives, you put it in a spreadsheet. And then I'm going to take all the evidence I get and I'm going to put it in that spreadsheet. So that could be mom's social media posts. That could be evidence from mom's computer, from mom's phone, text messages mom sent to friends about the health of the child. And what you see when you start to sort those by date is you see a pattern of lying by mom. So if I can show a pattern of lying, like let's say it's a feeding tube let's say it's a falsification case. I want to show a pattern of lying before the feeding tube was placed. And through text messages, through social media and everything. Then I'm going to take those messages to the doctor who placed the feeding tube. And I'm going to ask the doctor this question. I'm going to show him those messages. I'm going to show him the lies. I'm going to say, is that consistent with medical history that you were getting or what you were seeing in clinic? And he's going to say no. And I'm going to say, okay, keeping in mind that mom has lied about medical history, and these lies are substantial on social media and on her devices, would you have relied on mom's, if you had known that, would you have relied on mom's history to perform this surgery? The answer every time is no, right? And that's what I need from a doctor in order to get probable cause to arrest. And, you keep pursuing evidence in order to get proof beyond a reasonable doubt, right? And that evidence can come from your interview of the suspect. They are not... While they are good liars, they are not used to police tactics in an interview. They are never used to being questioned. You'll see literature from psych professionals who say they'll never admit. That is not true. You can get admissions from them. You're never going to get the whole truth, but you can get admissions from them.
Dude, I can tell you right now, I've almost never gotten a full truth from anybody. You get some, putting themselves in a situation, or it's by accident, I didn't mean it, whatever it might be, but they implicate themselves, but they never get the whole story.
Right, and that just, and again, it shows like they're like every other offender that we interview in that situation. So you can get a lot of. I've started, I used to think, well, I want to get all my evidence together before I start interviewing these offenders. Started to bump that up as I've gotten more experience, bump the interview timeline up, and I want to get in there earlier because, there's going to be family court. They're going to have a family court lawyer. If the family court lawyer has any snap to them at all, they're going to say, don't talk to the cops. Right. So I definitely want to, I've started to really bump that up. If it's an induction and that child's in the hospital, you definitely want to go to the hospital and you want to interview the person then. You want to search the hospital room. Now, they don't have any expectation of privacy in the room. They have expectation of privacy in their belongings inside the room, not the room itself. You can search under cushions. You may find syringes. You may find who knows whatever. And they're also not advanced criminals, right? So they don't, most of the time, they're going to give you consent to look in their purse or their bags or whatever. So you can approach it that way, too. That's on an induction case.
Now, earlier in the conversation, Mike, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're running short on time. You used the word mom many times. Is this most always women that do this, the mothers?
I use that because every one of my offenders has been mother of the child, except the one I had a grandmother of the child. But there is literature, I think a literature study from 2017, they looked at 796 cases of this abuse, and 95.6% of the offenders were the mother of the child, 97.6% were female.
See,
there are
staggering.
male offenders out there.
Yeah. And here's the one thing I want people to keep in mind. There are children that have died from this. It's not that every case is a success. There are some that have horrible endings.
Absolutely. The Olivia Gant case in Colorado is a prime example. And the mortality rate in this abuse is 6 to 9%. And that's probably second only to abusive head trauma in mortality in child abuse.
I was reading something somewhere, Mike, and I can't bring it off the top of my head where I have facts, but the leading cause of death of people under the age of 15 is homicide.
Right. Doesn't surprise me at all.
As a cop, it doesn't surprise me either. But then secondly is accident. And sometimes accident, when you get over 15, driving comes into play quite often, and accidents rise. But it makes you wonder how many, I'm thinking of a conversation, how many incidents in my career where children died was at Munchausen by proxy? And the truth is, I'll never know.
Right. And just so your audience knows, I mean, from 2009 to 2016, I investigated 16 reports of this abuse. Not all reports. It's happening, right? We filed 6 criminal cases, 5 convictions for child abuse, 1 conviction for Medicaid fraud. And I came to the sheriff's office in 2018. And since then, we've filed cases on 11 offenders over here.
That's pretty eye-popping statistic when you think about it.
Yeah, it's one Texas county. That's one Texas county, one children's hospital.
And last question before we go into your book. Where did the name Munchausen by proxy come from? You talked about where it originated, but what does it mean?
Yeah, Dr. Richard Asher back in the 50s, he identified people who do this to themselves, right, who present themselves as ill when they're not to get medical treatment. And he called that Munchausen. Munchausen was a German baron who told wild stories. I think one of them was he rode a cannonball over a city, and he would tell wild tales. And I think there's a collection of his tales actually out in the book. And so Dr. Asher chose to name this Munchausen, and then Munchausen by proxy obviously comes from doing it to someone else, your child. So and it doesn't have to be a child. It can be done to any vulnerable victim. It can be done to elderly.
And that's the subject of your book, The Mother Next Door, Medicine, Deceit, and Munchausen by Proxy. Just do a Google search. You will find it. MikeWeberConsulting.com. I would imagine that you're in demand, especially when it comes to investigating Munchausen by proxy. Is that what this is about?
Yeah, the book is about 3 of my earlier cases on this abuse, including my current sheriff's daughter's case. He adopted her after the abuse. She's now 17 and quite the little fire plug. It involves her case. It involves 2 good outcomes and 1 bad outcome. And we examine the systemic failures that we see consistently in this abuse. And those failures are normally at the next level, either through the criminal court system or the family court system.
And that's what I have to talk about in the future, because I'd imagine you'd have to have attorneys that are specialized in this, because it's not something that everybody can prosecute and do well. Mike, thanks for your service, number 1. And number 2, thanks so much for being a guest on the show and talking about this very uncomfortable situation.
Certainly. And just to your listeners, especially your law enforcement listeners, I still work for the Tarrant County Sheriff's Office. If you get one of these cases, I will consult for free if you need some guidance.
There you go. Thanks again, Mike. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
If you want to be a guest on the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show, simply contact us. It couldn't be easier. You can send us a message on Facebook. Look for and like the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show page, or email jay@letradio.com. That's JAY@letradio.com. This was the podcast version of the nationally syndicated Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show, and we are so glad that you decided to join us. Big thanks to our guests for telling their story on the show. Two simple things you can do. Be sure to check out our website, letradio.com. That's letradio.com. And be sure to follow us or like us on Facebook. Do a search on Facebook for Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. And be sure when you see a post that we put up that you like, that you resonate with, that gets your attention, be sure to share it with your friends. We'll be back in just a few days with another great episode of the show. See you then.